They say that when you sleep, your soul travels. But in July of 1956, a 14-year-old girl named Linda Morgan did something that physics says is impossible. She went to sleep in a warm bed on a luxury Italian ocean liner, and she woke up on the cold steel deck of a Swedish icebreaker. And she never touched the water. The newspapers called her the Miracle Girl. They turned her survival into a fairy tale to comfort a terrified public. But there was no magic that night. There was only the terrifying indifference of heavy machinery. This is not just a story about two ships colliding in the fog. It is the story of the Andrea Doria, a floating palace of art and ambition that was sold to the world as unsinkable. It is the story of the precise moment when the glamour of the Golden Age smashed headlong into the arrogance of the Machine Age. Tonight, we are going to peel back the layers of the legend. We are going to step inside the radar room where the fatal mistakes were made. We are going to walk the tilted decks where the champagne glasses slid into the abyss. And we are going to uncover the forgotten price of the technology we trust with our lives. So, turn down the lights, settle in, and let's drift back to the night when the ocean proved that no matter how much steel you build, you can never engineer out the human element. Welcome to the deep. It starts with the sound of breathing, not the steady rhythmic breathing of deep sleep, but the jagged, shallow gasps of someone whose body knows it has been broken, even before the mind wakes up to realize it. It is dark. The air smells wrong. It does not smell like the lavender and starched linen of a first-class cabin. It smells of heavy grease, unwashed wool, and the sharp metallic tang of dried blood. A girl opens her eyes. Her name is Linda Morgan. She is 14 years old. Yesterday, she fell asleep in cabin 52 on the upper deck of the most beautiful ship in the world. She fell asleep wrapped in the security of Italian luxury, drifting across a calm July ocean toward New York City. But now she is not in cabin 52. She is lying on a strange deck, surrounded by men speaking a language she does not understand. They look at her with a mixture of horror and reverence, as if she were a ghost that had just materialized out of the salt spray. She tries to move, but her legs refuse to answer. She looks down. The pajamas she wore to bed are yellow. They are now stained dark. She calls out for her mother. She calls out for her stepfather. There is no answer, only the vibration of a ship's engine beneath her, a different engine, a different rhythm. Linda Morgan does not know it yet, but she has just performed a feat that physics says is impossible. She has traveled from one moving object to another, across a chasm of open sea, amidst the violent shrieking of tearing steel, without touching the water. The doctors who will examine her later will struggle to find the words. They will look at the bruising, the shattered knees, the impossible trajectory of her body, and they will shake their heads. The newspapers, always hungry for a headline that simplifies the chaotic tapestry of tragedy, will call her the Miracle Girl. They will splash her face across front pages from Rome to New York. They will turn her survival into a fairy tale to distract from the carnage. But there is no magic here. There is only momentum, geometry, and the terrifying indifference of heavy machinery. To understand how a 14-year-old girl ends up alone on the deck of a stranger's ship, we cannot start with the collision. We cannot start with the fog. We must go back to the beginning, to the time before the metal screamed. We must look at the world that built these ships, a world that had convinced itself it had finally conquered the ocean. It was the middle of the 20th century, a golden hour between the end of the greatest war in history and the dawn of the jet age. It was a time when the Atlantic Ocean was not just a body of water, it was a highway. It was a thoroughfare of glamour and steel, a place where the traumas of the 1940s were being smoothed over by cocktails, ballroom dancing, and the reassuring hum of steam turbines. People believed in safety then. They didn't just hope for it, they bought it. It was a product, marketed alongside crystal glassware and air conditioning. The shipping lines sold the idea that the ocean had been tamed. They printed brochures on thick, glossy paper, showing ships that looked like floating palaces immune to the elements. They spoke of watertight compartments, of radar that could see through the thickest dark, of double hulls and gyroscopic stabilizers that promised to keep the champagne in the glass even during a gale. Fear had been engineered out of the experience. When you stepped onto a liner in the 1950s, you were stepping into a bubble of civilization, The chaotic, wet, freezing reality of the North Atlantic was kept at bay by rivets and welding torches. Passengers walked on teak decks, dressed in tuxedos and evening gowns, suspended 50 feet above a crushing abyss, and they felt nothing but the gentle vibration of progress. It was the age of the unsinkable, the sequel. And like all sequels, it forgot the lessons of the original. This confidence was not arrogance exactly. It was exhaustion. The world was tired of death. It was tired of chaos. It wanted clean lines and predictable arrivals. It wanted to believe that if you built a machine big enough, strong enough, and expensive enough, it could negotiate with nature on its own terms. And out of this desire, out of this desperate need for national redemption and modern luxury, rose the Andrea Doria. She was not just a ship, she was a statement. For Italy, still sweeping up the rubble of fascism and defeat, the Andrea Doria was a floating renaissance. She was proof that Italian hands could still craft masterpieces, that Italian engineering could rival the British and the Americans. She was named after a 16th century admiral, a prince of the sea, and she carried herself with the same aristocratic bearing. She was built in Genoa, in the Ansaldo shipyards, where the noise of riveting guns echoed like gunfire for years. But unlike the massive floating fortresses of the pre-war era, the Andrea Doria was designed for beauty. She was sleek, with a sharp, raked bow that looked like it was yearning for the horizon. Her funnel was a work of sculpture, painted in the colors of the Italian flag, green, white, and red. Inside, she was an art gallery. Her walls were adorned with murals, tapestries, and ceramics commissioned from the greatest living Italian artists. There was a bronze statue of the Admiral himself, standing guard in the first-class lounge. There were swimming pools, 3 of them, terraced on the aft decks like a Roman resort. The brochure writers called her a living museum. They promised that a voyage on the Andrea Doria was not just transportation, it was a cultural event. But beneath the velvet and the oil paintings there were compromises. There always are. To make her beautiful, to make her fast, and to make her profitable, decisions were made in the drafting rooms that would sit quietly in the blueprints, waiting for the wrong moment to reveal themselves. She was top-heavy. It was a whisper among the engineers, a footnote in the stability reports. All that luxury, all those heavy decks stacked high to give passengers the best views and the freshest air, raised her center of gravity. She was designed to roll, to move with the waves, but she struggled to come back to center. When her fuel tanks were empty at the end of a voyage, she rode high and tender. The engineers knew this. The captains knew this. It was managed with ballast, with water, with careful handling. It was a quirk of her beauty, a flaw in her character that was forgiven because she was so magnificent to look at, and people loved her. She was the darling of the southern route. While other ships battled the cold storms of the North Atlantic, the Andrea Doria sailed the sunny southern route, slipping through the Mediterranean, past Gibraltar, and across the warmer latitudes before turning north toward New York. She was a ship of sunshine and wine. On July 17, 1956, she left Genoa for her 51st crossing. It was routine. It was mundane. That is the most dangerous thing a journey can be. The manifest was a cross-section of the world. There were movie stars and politicians in first class, sipping Negronis and discussing the Suez Crisis. There were priests and professors in cabin class. And deep in the belly of the ship, in tourist class, there were immigrants, families from Calabria and Sicily, leaving behind everything they knew for a rumor of a better life in America. They carried their entire lives in cardboard suitcases and wooden trunks, trusting their future to the steel walls of this great Italian palace. Among the passengers in first class were the Petersons and their daughters, but also traveling with them was a quiet, observant 14-year-old girl named Linda Morgan. She was the daughter of Edward Morgan, a famous radio broadcaster. But here on the ocean she was just Linda. She had dark hair and a shy smile. She loved the ocean, but she treated it with the casual indifference of the young. To her, the ship was a hotel that moved. Linda's cabin, number 52, was on the upper deck on the starboard side. It was a prime location, high up, with fresh air and easy access to the promenade. It was the kind of room you booked when you wanted the best. She shared it with her younger half-sister. They had spent the voyage playing games, exploring the decks, and watching the endless blue horizon shift and change. For 8 days the voyage was perfect. The sun shone, the pools were full. The dining hall served risotto and veal to the sound of string quartets. The Andrea Doria cut through the water at a steady 23 knots, a white wake trailing behind her like a bridal train. She was a machine, doing exactly what she was designed to do, conquer distance with style. Linda didn't think about the hull plating. She didn't think about the watertight bulkheads or the radar scanners spinning endlessly above the bridge. Why would she? The ship was solid. The floor beneath her feet felt as permanent as the ground. The idea that this massive structure could be fragile, that it could be torn open, was as abstract as the concept of infinity. But while the Andrea Doria steamed west, closing the distance to New York, another shape was moving east. It was the MS Stockholm. If the Andrea Doria was a floating piece of art, the Stockholm was a floating ice pick. She was Swedish. She was smaller, barely half the size of the Italian liner. She was painted a stark, clinical white. She was not built for luxury, she was built for endurance. Her bow was strengthened with extra steel to smash through the pack ice of the Scandinavian waters. She was sharp, raked, and aggressive. The Stockholm was a no-nonsense ship run by a no-nonsense crew. Her captain, Harry Gunnar Nordenson, was a disciplinarian, a man of charts and schedules. His officers were young, serious, and efficient. On the bridge, the atmosphere was quiet and professional. There were no murals of Renaissance princes here. There was only the smell of polished brass and the cold logic of navigation. The Stockholm was leaving New York, heading toward Gothenburg. She was empty of passengers, or nearly so, compared to the packed Doria. She was heading into the sunset, picking up speed, eager to get into the open ocean. 2 ships, 2 cultures. One Italian, expressive, proud of its beauty, perhaps a little top-heavy with hubris. One Swedish, rigid, functional, sharp as a knife. They were drawn from opposite sides of the world, converging on a single point in the vastness of the Atlantic. The ocean is big. It is incomprehensibly vast. To find another ship in the middle of the Atlantic is like finding a specific grain of sand in a desert. And yet, shipping lanes funnel this vastness into narrow corridors. Near the coast of North America, off the island of Nantucket, these lanes tighten. It is a crossroads of the sea, a place where inbound and outbound traffic squeeze past each other. It is also a place of ghosts. The waters off Nantucket are notorious. The cold Labrador current crashes into the warm Gulf Stream, and the result is fog. Not the mist that drifts over a morning meadow, but a wall. A thick, suffocating blanket that swallows light and sound. Sailors call it the shroud. It creates a world where the sky and the sea dissolve into a single, grey void. On the afternoon of July 25th, the Andrea Doria entered this void. The sun, which had been their companion for the entire crossing, simply vanished. The horizon, usually a sharp line dividing the world, blurred and erased itself. The blue water turned to a dull, oily grey. The air grew heavy and damp, clinging to the skin. Captain Calamai of the Andrea Doria was a veteran. He had spent his life at sea. He knew this fog. He respected it. But he also had a schedule. He was late. Not by much, but enough to irk a captain who prided himself on precision. He ordered the watertight doors closed, a standard precaution. He posted extra lookouts on the bow, men straining their eyes against the grey nothingness, looking for shadows that might harden into shapes. But the real eyes of the ship were not human. They were electronic. In the chart room, the radar screen glowed with a hypnotic green sweep. A line of light rotated like the hand of a clock, painting the world in phosphorescent blips. This was the miracle of the modern age. With radar, you didn't need to see. You could look through the fog. You could see the truth of the ocean stripped of its visual lies, or so they believed. Radar in 1956 was not the computer-assisted collision avoidance system of today. It was raw data. It required interpretation. A blip on the screen was just a blob of light. It didn't tell you what the object was. It didn't tell you how big it was. It didn't tell you its intention. You had to plot it. You had to take a grease pencil, mark a dot, wait a few minutes, mark another dot, and then draw a line to estimate where the stranger was going. It was a process that required math, patience, and assumption. And assumption is the mother of all disasters. As the afternoon wore on, the fog thickened. It became a physical presence, pressing against the windows of the bridge. The foghorn began to sound. Whoom! A deep, mournful bellow that shook the rivets of the ship. It sounded every 100 seconds, a heartbeat of warning sent out into the blind world. Down in the dining salons, the passengers barely noticed. The lights were bright, the wine was pouring, and the orchestra was playing Arrivederci Roma. The foghorn was just atmospheric background noise, a reminder that they were at sea, adding a cozy sense of isolation to their party. They were safe inside the whale, warm and fed, while the elements raged impotently outside. Linda Morgan was in the dining room with her family. They were celebrating the last night of the voyage. Tomorrow they would see the Statue of Liberty. Tomorrow, Linda would be back in the noise and heat of an American summer. Tonight was for dessert and laughter. She wore a simple dress, her hair brushed neat. She looked around at the other tables, the clinking glasses, the waiters balancing trays with balletic grace, the smoke from cigarettes curling up into the air-conditioning vents. It was a scene of perfect, manufactured tranquility. But on the bridge, the tension was rising. The radar had picked up a target, a blip, 17 miles away. Captain Calamai bent over the scope. He watched the sweep. The blip was moving fast. It was coming directly at them. He did the mental math. If both ships held their course, they would pass close. Too close for comfort in this soup. But the radar suggested they would pass starboard to starboard, right side to right side. It was an unusual way to pass. The rules of the road generally dictated port to port, left to left like cars on a road. But if the other ship was already set up for a starboard pass, Calamai didn't want to cut across his bow to change it. He decided to widen the gap. He ordered a slight turn to port, just 4 degrees, a nudge, enough to give them more room. He trusted the green light. He trusted his interpretation. He believed the other ship saw him, understood him, and was doing the same. Miles away on the bridge of the Stockholm, the scene was different. The Stockholm was not in the fog yet. She was sailing under a clear moonlit sky, the stars sharp and cold above her. But ahead, her officers saw the wall, a dark, nebulous bank of cloud swallowing the ocean. And on their radar, they saw a blip. They plotted it, they marked the grease pencil dots. But their math told a different story. They didn't see a ship passing starboard to starboard. They saw a ship positioned to pass port to port, but the gap was tight. The third officer of the Stockholm, young and eager to follow the strict orders of his captain, decided to widen the gap as well. He ordered a turn to starboard, to the right. Think about this moment. Visualize the geometry. 2 massive steel cities, moving at a combined speed of over 40 knots. That is nearly 50 miles per hour. One is in thick fog, the other is in clear air, staring into the fog. One captain believes they are passing right to right and turns left to give more room. The other officer believes they are passing left to left and turns right to give more room. They are not avoiding each other. They are turning toward each other. They are turning into a collision course that neither intends, guided by the very instruments designed to save them. The ocean does not care about misunderstandings. It only cares about vectors. And the vectors were now locked. The distance closed. 12 miles, 10 miles, 5 miles. On the Andrea Doria, the foghorn kept bellowing. Whoom! On the Stockholm, the officer stared at the radar, puzzled. The blip wasn't behaving as he expected. It was closing fast. Too fast. He couldn't see the ship lights yet. Why couldn't he see the lights? Linda Morgan finished her dinner. She said goodnight to her stepfather and mother. She walked to the cabin she shared with her sister. She brushed her teeth. She changed into her yellow pajamas. She climbed into the bed nearest the wall, the one on the starboard side, the side facing the oncoming Stockholm. She pulled the sheets up. The bed was soft. The vibration of the engines was a lullaby. She closed her eyes, thinking about New York, about her friends, about the future. She felt safe. She was on the Andrea Doria. Nothing could happen here. Above her, on the bridge, the silence was breaking. "Why doesn't he turn?" Calamai muttered, staring at the scope. The blip was getting brighter, larger. It was invading the safety zone. "He is coming right at us," an officer whispered. Then, out of the grey wool of the fog, lights appeared. Not the small, distant twinkle of a ship passing safely in the night. These were bright, terrible lights. The masthead lights of a steamer, arranged in a line that meant only one thing: she was heading straight for them. And then, the red light. The port running light. When a sailor sees the red light of another ship, it means stop. It means danger. It means the other ship is crossing your path. Calamai shouted an order. "Harder port! Turn left, turn away, swing the stern out of the danger." It was a desperate maneuver, a reflex. The giant wheel spun. The rudder groaned against the rushing water. The Andrea Doria, all 30,000 tons of her, began to lean. She began to swing. On the Stockholm, the officer saw the Doria burst out of the fog wall. He saw the massive black hull, the rows of illuminated portholes, the towering funnel. He saw a mountain of steel suddenly materialize directly in front of his bow. Harder starboard, full astern. The engines of the Stockholm screamed as they tried to reverse. The propellers thrashed the water, trying to arrest the momentum of the ice-hardened Swedish ship. But water is slippery. Momentum is a law that cannot be repealed by a shout. It was too late. The math had run its course. The time for decisions was over. Now it was just time for impact. The bow of the Stockholm, sharp as a chisel, aimed directly at the side of the Andrea Doria. It aimed at the upper deck. It aimed at the cabins. It aimed at cabin 52. The silence of the fog was about to end. The era of confidence was about to end. The miracle and the nightmare was about to begin. The seconds before a catastrophe are the longest seconds in history. They stretch. They distort. Time stops acting like a steady flow of sand in an hourglass and becomes something viscous, something you can almost taste. On the bridge of the Andrea Doria, time had frozen. Let us pause the film here. Let us hold these two ships in that final, terrible breath before contact. To understand why this happened, you have to understand the seductive danger of the radar room. In 1956, radar was the voice of God. It told you what your eyes could not see. But the God was speaking a language the priests did not fully understand. The officers on the Andrea Doria were looking at a screen that showed relative motion. They saw the Stockholm as a dot moving across their glass. But because they were also moving, the line they saw wasn't the other ship's true path. It was a phantom path, a trick of geometry. They believed the Stockholm was staying to the south, passing them safely on the right. On the Stockholm, the young third officer, Carstens Johansson, was looking at the same geometry but drawing the opposite conclusion. He had plotted the dots. He was certain, mathematically certain, that the Doria was to his north, passing on the left. And here is the tragedy of the machine age. Both men were competent. Both men were trying to be safe. Both men were following the logic of their instruments. But they were operating in different realities. The radar had not failed. It had simply provided data without context. It gave them the where, but it did not give them the intention. And so the decisions were made. The Stockholm turned right to give the Doria more room. The Doria turned left to give the Stockholm more room. It is a dance of death. If one of them had done nothing, they might have missed. If both had been reckless, they might have missed. But because both tried to be careful in opposite ways, they locked themselves into a collision course that a computer could not have plotted more perfectly. Back in cabin 52, the physics of the turn began to take hold. When a massive liner like the Andrea Doria turns hard to the left at high speed, she leans. She heels over to the right. It is centrifugal force. The floor of Linda Morgan's cabin tilted. Her bed, the one against the outer wall, dipped lower. She didn't wake up. The motion was smooth like a cradle, rocking. Deep in the hull, the machinery of the ship groaned. The propellers bit into the water, fighting the rudder. The ship was trying to pivot, trying to swing her tail out of the way of the oncoming knife. She was a dancer trying to spin away from a bullet. But a ship is not a dancer. A ship is inertia wrapped in steel. The fog vanished. Just like that. The Andrea Doria slid out of the grey curtain and into the clear moonlit water that the Stockholm had been sailing in. And there it was. The Stockholm was no longer a blip. It was a terrifying reality. A white bow, high and sharp, churning a mountain of foam, aimed directly at the Doria's flank. Captain Calamai stood on the wing of the bridge. He did not scream. He did not run. He watched. There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a captain when the outcome is no longer in doubt. It is the silence of a man watching his life's work turn into history. The Stockholm struck. It did not sound like a crash. That is what the movies get wrong. A crash is a sudden, sharp impact. This was a grinding. It was the sound of a saw moving through bone. It was a low, resonant shriek that traveled through the steel skeletons of both ships, vibrating the floors, rattling the glasses in the bar, shaking the fillings in passengers' teeth. The Stockholm's bow was reinforced for ice. It was designed to break solid frozen sheets in the Baltic Sea. The Andrea Doria was built for luxury. Her hull was strong, but it was not armor. The Swedish prow sliced into the Italian side just aft of the bridge. It didn't bounce off. It entered. It drove 30 feet deep into the Andrea Doria. It cut through the outer plating like paper. It smashed through the A-deck. It smashed through the upper deck. It obliterated the foyer deck. It went through the generator room. It went through the fuel tanks. It went through cabin 52. The violence of that specific moment is hard to comprehend. Cabin 52 was a room of wood paneling, soft fabrics, and 2 sleeping girls. In a fraction of a second, the wall of the room ceased to exist. The floor buckled. The ceiling collapsed. The white steel of the Stockholm's bow plowed through the space, occupying the room, erasing it. Linda Morgan was in the bed on the right. Her sister was in the bed on the left. The bow of the Stockholm acted like a plow. It shattered the bed where Linda's sister lay. It crushed the partition wall. The sister, tragically, was killed instantly, lost in the chaotic tumble of debris and steel. But for Linda, the physics were different. The Stockholm's nose was high. It crashed into the cabin at an angle. It caught Linda's mattress. It didn't crush her. It scooped her. Imagine a shovel sliding under a pile of earth. The shovel lifts the earth up and carries it. The Stockholm was the shovel. Linda was the earth. She was lifted up, bed and all, amidst a hurricane of splintering wood and twisting metal. She was pushed backward, up and over the wreckage of the Stockholm's own crushed bow. Then the momentum shifted. The Stockholm, having expended its energy, shuddered to a halt. The ships were locked together for a moment, 2 wounded giants embracing in the dark. The Doria was still moving forward, dragging the Stockholm's bow sideways, twisting the metal, grinding the wound open even wider. Then they separated. The Stockholm pulled back, its bow smashed and crumpled, like a boxer's nose after a knockout punch. And there, lying on the wreckage of the Stockholm's forecastle, 60 feet away from where she had gone to sleep, lay Linda Morgan. She was not on the Andrea Doria anymore. She had been deported from one country to another in the blink of an eye. She was lying in her yellow pajamas on the cold, wet steel of the ship that had just killed her sister. She was alive. She didn't know it yet. She didn't know any of it. She was unconscious, shielded by shock, her body a small, broken thing amidst the ruin of 10,000 tons of machinery. On the Andrea Doria, the world had tilted. The collision had ripped open the fuel tanks on the starboard side. 500 tons of seawater rushed in to replace the lighter fuel oil. On the port side, the fuel tanks were still full of air and oil. The balance was gone. The ship lurched violently to the right. She listed 20 degrees instantly. In the dining room, the Arrivederci Roma stopped. The tables slid. Plates, glasses, bottles of wine, and silver tureens crashed to the floor in a cacophony of shattering crystal. Passengers were thrown from their chairs. Waiters tumbled into the debris. The elegant mural of the Roman Forum looked down on a scene of sudden, horizontal chaos. The lights flickered. They dimmed, turned orange, then black. Then the emergency generators kicked in, a dim red gloom that made everything look like the inside of a furnace. Panic is a slow contagion. At first there was just confusion. People stood up, brushing glass from their clothes, laughing nervously. A big wave, someone said. Just a rogue wave. They wanted to believe it. They looked at each other, waiting for the captain's voice, waiting for the lights to come back, waiting for the ship to straighten up. But the ship did not straighten up. The floor remained at a crazy, impossible angle. Walking was no longer walking. It was climbing. To cross a hallway meant scrambling up a steep slope. Deep inside the ship, the water was roaring. It wasn't a trickle. It was a river. The Atlantic Ocean was claiming the Andrea Doria, reclaiming the space that the engineers had carved out for air and luxury. Back on the Stockholm, the crew was reeling. Their ship was battered. The bow was a crumpled accordions of steel. But the watertight doors held. The Stockholm was not sinking. She was floating, bobbing in the swells, bleeding but alive. A Spanish crewman on the Stockholm, a man named Bernabe Polanco, was sent forward to check the damage. He climbed over the twisted metal of the bow. He shone his flashlight into the wreckage, looking for fires, looking for structural failures. The beam of his light cut through the dark. It played over jagged shards of steel, over pieces of Italian furniture that had been snagged by the collision. And then the light fell on something yellow. Polanco stopped. He squinted. He moved closer, stepping carefully over the sharp debris. He saw a girl. She was curled up in a small pocket of wreckage, sheltered behind a wall of twisted steel. She was moving. He froze. He crossed himself. This was impossible. They were in the middle of the ocean. There were no passengers on the Stockholm's bow. There was only the sea and the wreckage. He scrambled toward her. He spoke to her in Spanish. She didn't answer. She moaned. "Mama," she whispered. She spoke in English. Polanco didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. He understood the need. He lifted her up. She was light, fragile. He carried her away from the edge, away from the abyss where the dark water churned below. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know she was the miracle girl. To him, she was a ghost that had become flesh. Back on the Andrea Doria, the reality was setting in. The list was getting worse. 22 degrees. It is hard to describe what 22 degrees feels like. Imagine your house suddenly tilting until the walls feel like floors and the floors feel like walls. Furniture slides, people slide. Captain Calamai was on the bridge, gripping the railing to keep from falling. He looked at the inclinometer. The needle was buried in the red zone. He knew the ship was doomed. He knew it in his stomach before his brain fully processed the math. The Andrea Doria had been built to stay afloat, with 2 compartments flooded. But the Stockholm had pierced 5. And there was another problem, a problem that had been hiding in the blueprints for years, waiting for this exact angle. The lifeboats. The Andrea Doria had enough lifeboats for everyone. The law required it. But the law assumed the ship would be relatively level. On the port side, the high side, the boats were now hanging out over the deck, swung in by gravity. They couldn't be lowered. They would drag against the side of the ship. They were useless, heavy ornaments. On the starboard side, the low side, the boats were swung out too far. They were dangling over the open water. But the angle was so steep that it was almost impossible to load them. Half the lifeboats were gone, just like that. Calamai looked out at the dark ocean. He had 1,600 souls on board. He had half the boats he needed, and the water was rising. This is the moment when systems collapse. The radar had failed them. The design had failed them. The watertight compartments had failed them. Now, there was only the human element left. There was no screaming on the bridge, just hushed orders. "Radio," Calamai said. "Send the SOS." The radio operator keyed the mic. "SOS, SOS, collision, need immediate assistance." The signal went out into the night, traveling at the speed of light, bouncing off the ionosphere. It was heard by ships miles away. It was heard by the Ile-de-France, a giant French liner heading east. It was heard by a freighter, the Cape Ann. It was heard by the U.S. Navy transport, Pute William H. Thomas, and it was heard by the Stockholm. "We have collided with you," the Doria radioed. "We are sinking. Send boats." The Stockholm replied, "We are badly damaged, but we will send what we can." In the chaos, no one missed Linda Morgan. Her stepfather, Edward Morgan, was frantically searching the listing corridors. He found his wife. She was injured, trapped in their cabin, but alive. He freed her. They stumbled out into the hallway, the floor slick with oil and seawater. "The girls!" his wife gasped. Where are the girls? Edward fought his way toward cabin 52. The hallway was a nightmare. Smoke was filling the air. People were screaming in Italian and English. He climbed up the slanted floor, pulling himself along the handrail. He reached the door to cabin 52, or rather, he reached the place where the door used to be. He opened it and looked inside. There was nothing. No floor, no beds, no girls, just a gaping hole. A jagged mouth opening directly onto the Atlantic Ocean. The moonlight shone in, illuminating the dark waves frothing 50 feet below. He stood there, staring at the void. The sound of the ocean was loud, drowning out the screams of the passengers behind him. He looked for a shred of clothing, a piece of luggage, anything. There was nothing. Just the sea. He turned back. He had to tell his wife. He had to tell her that their daughters were gone, that they had vanished into the air, that they were buried at sea before the ship had even sunk. He didn't know that miles away, on the deck of the ship that had destroyed his life, his daughter was opening her eyes. Linda Morgan lay on a stretcher in the Stockholm's infirmary. The air was sharp with the smell of iodine and rubbing alcohol. Sailors were running past the door. The ship was rolling in the swell. She looked at her arm. It was broken. She looked at her legs. They were covered in bruises. She tried to remember. She remembered the dinner. She remembered the bed. She remembered the sound of the foghorn. Then, a loud noise. A terrible noise. And then, waking up here. "Where is my mother?" she asked a nurse who was hurrying by. The nurse stopped. She looked at this girl, this strange, battered child who had appeared out of the wreckage like a stowaway from the sea. The nurse didn't know who she was. No one knew who she was. "Rest," the nurse said. "Just rest." Linda closed her eyes. She felt the ship moving under her, but it felt wrong. It wasn't the smooth glide of the Andrea Doria. It was a jerky, wounded motion. "I'm on the wrong ship," she thought. The thought floated in her mind, hazy and dreamlike. "I must be dreaming." But she wasn't dreaming. She was the first refugee of the disaster. She was the proof that the impossible could happen. Back on the Doria, the panic was starting to curdle into despair. The ship was settling. The water was creeping up the stairs on the lower decks. The lights were dying. The captain gave the order. "Abandon ship." But how? How do you evacuate a city that is falling over? How do you get grandmothers and infants down a slick steel cliff into bobbing wooden boats? The crew began to improvise. They tied ropes to the railings. They formed human chains. They became a living ladder, passing children hand over hand down the side of the listing giant. And out in the dark, the lights of the other ships began to appear. They came from all directions. The Ile-de-France, glowing like a city, turned around and burned every ounce of oil she had to get there. The Cape Ann diverted. The Navy ships turned. The ocean, usually a lonely place, was suddenly crowded. It was a gathering of witnesses, a floating audience arriving to watch the death of a queen. But for the people clinging to the rails of the Andrea Doria, looking down at the black water, the arrival of the other ships was not just a rescue. It was a validation. It meant they hadn't been forgotten. It meant that the world knew. And amidst the thousands of people scrambling for life, one girl was already safe. She was safe, but she was alone. She was the girl without a country, without a family, without a past. She was just a body that the ocean had rejected. The night was far from over. The sinking would take hours. The drama of the rescue would become one of the greatest maritime stories ever told. But the miracle had already happened. The steel had opened. The girl had flown. And now she lay in the dark, waiting for the morning that would make her famous and the grief that would never leave her. The angle of the deck is now 25 degrees. If you have never stood on a floor tilted at 25 degrees, it is difficult to imagine the physics of it. It ceases to be a floor, it becomes a slide. A wall becomes a ceiling. A staircase becomes a trap. On the Andrea Doria, gravity, which had been a constant, invisible friend for the entire voyage, had suddenly turned into an enemy. The ship was not sinking quickly. That was the cruelty of it. A quick sinking is a shock. A slow sinking is a torture. It gives you time to think. It gives you time to look at the dark water and calculate the odds. The Andrea Doria was taking 11 hours to die. She was bleeding out, compartment by compartment, the water rising with the agonizing slowness of a clock hand. High above the water on the starboard side, the crew struggled with the remaining lifeboats. This was not the orderly drill practiced on sunny afternoons in Genoa. This was a brawl against friction and rust. The boats were heavy, steel and wood designed to be lowered vertically, but the ship was leaning away from them. To launch a boat, they had to push it out, fighting the weight of the vessel itself, fighting the cables that snagged and twisted. When the boats finally hit the water, they were far away from the side of the ship. The list had swung them out. Between the promenade deck and the safety of the boats lay a chasm of dark, oily water. There were no gangways. There were no polite stairs. There were only ropes. Jacob's ladders, flimsy contrivances of rope and wood, were tossed over the side. They twisted in the wind. They were slick with the oil that was spewing from the ruptured tanks. Old women, children, men in tuxedos, they all had to climb down these nets, suspended over the abyss. Fear has a smell. It smells like sweat and diesel fumes. It filled the air on the promenade deck. But there was remarkably little screaming. A strange, stunned hush had fallen over the crowd. They were waiting their turn. The social contract of the ocean liner, the class system, the manners, the deference, held together for a surprising amount of time. First class helped tourist class. Men helped women. The ritual of civilization persisted, even as the floor beneath them threatened to become a wall. But out in the darkness, help was coming. And it was coming with a grandeur that has never been seen before or since. The radar screens of the nearby ships were cluttered with the echo of the disaster. But one signal was brighter than the rest, the Île-de-France. She was a legend in her own right, a massive French liner, the epitome of Art Deco style and Gallic pride. She had been on her way to Europe, carrying nearly 2,000 passengers. When her captain, Baron Raoul de Beaudéon, heard the SOS, he didn't just alter course. He spun his Leviathan around. He cut the engines, reversed the props, and executed a turn that shuddered through the entire frame of his ship. He told his passengers nothing. He simply ordered full steam ahead. The Île-de-France burned oil like a furnace, pushing her boilers to the limit, racing back toward the coordinates of the dying Italian. When she arrived, the scene was apocalyptic. The Stockholm lay wounded and silent in the distance. The Andrea Doria was a dark, leaning shadow, glowing only with the dim red light of her emergency strobes. Captain de Beaudéon did something extraordinary. He did not park his ship miles away to stay safe. He drove the Île-de-France right into the danger zone. He brought her massive hull within 400 yards of the sinking Doria, and then he turned on the lights, all of them. He ordered every exterior light on the Île-de-France to be illuminated. The massive floodlights on the funnels, the deck lights, the cabin lights. In the middle of the black Atlantic night, a floating city suddenly blazed into existence. The name Île-de-France stood out in 10-foot-tall letters between her funnels, glowing like a neon sign of hope. To the people clinging to the rails of the Andrea Doria, it looked like the sun had risen early. It was a blinding, brilliant promise that they would not die in the dark. The water between the ships became a highway of small boats. The Ile launched her lifeboats. The Cape Ann launched hers. The Navy ships launched theirs. It was a chaotic regatta of salvation, but the confusion was absolute. Families had been separated in the rush. Mothers were in one boat, fathers in another, children in a third. They were ferried to different ships. Some went to the Stockholm, some to the Ile, some to the freighter. No one knew who was alive and who was dead. There were no passenger lists in the lifeboats. There were no cell phones to bridge the gap. There was only the silence of the separation. On the Stockholm, the confusion was just as deep, but of a different kind. The Swedish crew was tending to their own wounded and the refugees they had pulled from the water. The infirmary was full. In the corner, the girl in the yellow pajamas lay still. The sailors had given her a sedative. She drifted in and out of consciousness. When she was awake, she asked for her mother. When she slept, she twitched, her body remembering the flight through the air even if her mind suppressed it. They had found no identification on her. Why would they? She was in her sleepwear. She was a mystery, a Jane Doe. Meanwhile, on the listing deck of the Andrea Doria, a man was frantic. Edward Morgan, the broadcaster, the stepfather, was living a nightmare. He had found his wife. She was safe on a lifeboat. heading to one of the rescue ships. But his daughters? He had stared into the hole where their cabin used to be. He had seen the ocean. He had done the math. If the cabin was gone, the girls were gone. It was a deduction as cold and hard as the steel that had killed them. He boarded a lifeboat, a broken man. He was hoisted up the side of the Ile-de-France. He stood on the deck of the French ship, surrounded by blankets and hot coffee, and he looked back at the Andrea Doria. He watched the ship that had been his home for 8 days, the ship that was now the tomb of his family. He didn't know that on the other side of the debris field, on the very ship that had struck the blow, his stepdaughter was breathing. The irony of the Stockholm is that it became the safest place to be. The ship that caused the disaster was the only one that didn't sink. Her bow was crushed, her forward compartments were flooded, but behind the collision bulkhead, she was dry. She was stable. As the night wore on, the transfer of souls continued. It was a slow, exhausting process. The injured were hoisted in baskets. The elderly were carried on backs, and all the while the Andrea Doria continued her slow roll. She was tired. You could hear it in the groans of the metal. As the water filled the starboard side, the air trapped on the port side fought to escape. It hissed and bubbled. The swimming pools, once the jewel of the decks, emptied their water into the sea, only to be refilled by the ocean itself. By dawn, the evacuation was complete. The last lifeboat pulled away. Captain Calamai was the last to leave. He didn't want to go. He stood on the bridge of his dying command, debating whether to go down with her. It was an ancient tradition, a romantic, terrible obligation. But his officers refused to leave him. They practically dragged him off the ship. There is nothing more to do. They told him, she is dead. And she was. The sun rose over a calm, flat ocean. The fog was gone. The sky was a brilliant, indifferent blue. And under this cheerful light, the Andrea Doria entered her final agony. She lay on her side now, fully horizontal. The funnels touched the water. The sea rushed into the stacks. A giant bubble of steam and soot burst from the heart of the ship as the water hit the hot boilers. It was a spectacle, a morbid, fascinating show. Aircraft circled overhead, newsplanes, Coast Guard seaplanes. They filmed the death throes in color. Photographers on the nearby ships snapped pictures that would win Pulitzer Prizes. At 10:09 in the morning, exactly 11 hours after the collision, the Andrea Doria gave up. Her bow dipped. Her stern rose. The propeller's massive bronze blades that had pushed her through the Mediterranean and the Atlantic hung in the air for a moment, dripping wet, catching the morning sun. They looked like the helpless limbs of an overturned beetle. Then she slid, smoothly, quietly. There was no explosion, no final roar. She simply slipped beneath the surface. The water foamed white, then green, then blue. Debris popped up, deck chairs, life rings, pieces of wood. And then, silence. The queen of the Italian merchant marine was gone. She was now a wreck, settling into the mud 250 feet down. But the story was not at the bottom of the ocean. It was scattered across the rescuing ships. On the Stockholm, a crewman was looking through the passenger list of the Andrea Doria, trying to make sense of the survivors they had picked up. He looked at the girl in the infirmary. She had woken up again. She had given them a name. Linda, she said. Linda Morgan. The crewman ran his finger down the manifest. He found the Morgans, cabin 52. He stopped. He looked at the damage report of his own ship. He looked at the crushed bow. He looked at the location of the cabin on the Doria. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The geometry was impossible. For this girl to be here, she had to have been on the beak of the Stockholm when it pulled back. He went to the radio room. In New York, the news was breaking. The Andrea Doria has sunk. The headlines were already being set in lead type. Tragedy at sea. Hundreds feared dead. Edward Morgan, on the Ile-de-France, was preparing a broadcast. He was a professional. Even in his grief, the instinct to report, to tell the story, was there. He wrote a script in his head. He would speak of the loss. He would speak of the ocean. He would not mention his daughters by name, but the pain would be in his voice. Then a message came through, a radio telegram from the Stockholm. We have Linda Morgan, condition stable. It is said that hope is a cruel thing, but relief is a shock that can bring a man to his knees. Edward Morgan stared at the paper. He read it once, twice. Linda, one daughter. And the other? He asked. And Joan. The silence from the radio room was the answer. There was no message about Joan. Joan had been in the other bed. The miracle was partial. It was selective. The ships turned toward New York. The Ile-de-France, crowded with survivors, led the procession. The Stockholm, limping, her bow smashed, followed slowly behind, escorted by the Coast Guard. When they arrived in New York Harbor, the world was waiting. The piers were black with people. Reporters, cameras, doctors, families. The Ile-de-France docked first. The survivors disembarked. They were a parade of shock. Some were dressed in the borrowed clothes of the crew, oversized jumpers, wool hats. Some were still in their evening gowns, now stained with oil and salt. Edward Morgan walked down the gangway. He was surrounded by microphones. "Mr. Morgan, Mr. Morgan!" He had to tell them. He had to tell the world that the sea had taken one and given back the other. But the real frenzy was waiting for the Stockholm. When the crippled Swedish ship finally limped into the harbor a day later, the cameras were not trained on the captain. They were trained on a stretcher being carried off the ship. There she was, the miracle girl. Linda Morgan lay under a blanket, her face pale, her dark hair matted. She looked small. She looked ordinary. She did not look like someone who had defied death. She looked like a 14-year-old girl who had lost her sister and wanted to go home. But the flashbulbs didn't care about her grief. Pop, pop, pop. The light exploded in her face. The reporters shouted her name. "Linda, look this way! Linda, smile!" Smile. She had just survived a massacre, but the narrative had already been written. She was the happy ending. She was the silver lining in the cloud of disaster. The public didn't want to hear about the physics of the collision or the terror of the fog. They wanted the angel who flew. Linda closed her eyes against the glare. This was the beginning of the second trauma, the trauma of fame. The investigation began almost immediately, and here the story shifts from the operatic to the bureaucratic. In a normal crime, there is a villain, there is a gun, there is a motive. But in a maritime disaster, there is only procedure. Lawyers descended on New York. The Italian line sued the Swedish line. The Swedish line sued the Italian line. The passengers sued everyone. The hearings were held in a stuffy room in New York. Captain Calamai and Captain Nordenson sat at tables, flanked by men in suits. They looked tired. They looked diminished. These men, who had commanded floating cities, were now reduced to answering questions about grease pencil marks and radar settings. Why did you turn to port? Why did you turn to starboard? Did you see the fog? Did you check the plotter? Day after day, the testimony dragged on. Maps were drawn. Experts testified. The geometry of the collision was dissected by men who had never stood on a bridge in a pea-soup fog. And slowly a picture emerged. It wasn't a picture of one madman or one broken machine. It was a picture of two competent men caught in a web of small errors. The Stockholm was in the wrong lane, technically, but it was common practice. The Andrea Doria was speeding in fog, but everyone did it. The radar was misinterpreted by both sides. It was the banality of error. No one wanted to crash. Everyone thought they were being safe, but the public wanted a verdict. They wanted to know who was guilty. Was it the Italians with their flamboyant sailing? Was it the Swedes with their rigid adherence to course? They never got an answer. Before the hearings could conclude, before a judge could bang a gavel and assign blame, the lawyers made a deal. The insurance companies stepped in, a settlement was reached. The Italian line and the Swedish line agreed to drop their claims against each other. They pooled their money to pay the passengers. They sealed the records. The truth was buried in a vault of non-disclosure agreements. Why? Because the truth was too expensive. If the Andrea Doria was found to be unseaworthy, if that missing watertight door or those stability issues were proven in court, the liability would be astronomical. If the Stockholm was found reckless, the reputation of the Swedish line would be destroyed. So they compromised. They agreed to share the shame. Captain Calamai never went to sea again. He retired to his home in Italy, a broken man. He would sit by the window, staring at the Mediterranean, replaying those final 4 minutes in his head. "I should have turned right," he would whisper. "I should have stopped." He died a few years later, his heart worn out by the weight of 1,600 lives. The Stockholm was repaired. They cut off the smashed bow and welded on a new one. She went back to work. She was a working ship. After all, she had no soul to be haunted. She sailed for decades, changing names, changing owners, a ghost ship hiding in plain sight. And Linda? The miracle girl went back to school. She tried to be normal. She tried to be a teenager in the 1950s, but she carried a shadow. She was the girl who lived. When she walked down the street, people whispered, "That's her. That's the one." She didn't want to be the one. She wanted to be the sister of Joan. But Joan was gone, lost in the Atlantic, and Linda was left with the burden of being the story. The wreckage of the Andrea Doria lay on the bottom, dark and cold. The current swept over her. The murals dissolved, the velvet rotted. The grand piano in the lounge collapsed under the pressure. But the ship was not done with the living. It had become a destination. Divers began to visit. At first it was just the elite, the crazy ones who would risk the deep crush of the depth. They called her the Mount Everest of scuba diving. They swam through the holes in the hull. They swam through the promenade deck where the orchestra had played. They swam into the dining room. They brought back souvenirs, plates, bells, statues. And they brought back stories. They said the ship was alive. They said the currents ripped through the wreck like a gale. They said nets were draped over the steel like spiderwebs, waiting to snag the unwary. The Andrea Doria had killed 51 people on the night of the collision, but she wasn't finished. Over the years, she would kill more. Divers who got lost in the silt, divers who ran out of air, divers who panicked in the dark maze of the interior. The ship was protecting her secrets. She was guarding the memory of the night when the technology failed and the fog won. But for Linda Morgan, the wreck wasn't a place on a map. It was a place in her mind. It was the gap in her memory. It was the noise that woke her up in the middle of the night. She grew up, she got married, she had children, she lived a life. But she never fully left the deck of the Stockholm. Part of her was always there, lying in the yellow pajamas, looking up at the strange cold stars, wondering why the universe had reached down and plucked her from the fire, only to leave her shivering in the cold. The lawsuits settled the money, the history books recorded the dates. But the meaning was left floating, drifting like debris on the surface, waiting for someone to make sense of it. And as the years passed, the Andrea Doria began to change. She stopped being a tragedy and started being a fable, a warning. The world was moving on. The jet age had arrived. People didn't take ships to New York anymore. They flew. They sat in aluminum tubes, pressurized and radar-guided, trusting a new generation of machines. But the lesson of the Doria remained. It was a lesson about the arrogance of safety, a lesson about the fragility of systems. And as we look back at it now from the comfort of our modern digital world, we have to ask ourselves, have we really solved the problem? Or have we just built better fog? The radar screen in 1956 showed a green blip. Today, our screens show data streams and algorithms. But the person watching the screen is the same. The human brain, prone to distraction, prone to assumption, prone to seeing what it wants to see. The collision didn't happen because the radar broke. It happened because the people trusted it too much. They stopped looking out the window. And that is the ghost that still haunts the shipping lanes. The belief that we have conquered the unknown. The belief that if we have enough technology, we are safe. But the ocean knows better. The ocean is patient. It waits for the moment when we blink. It waits for the moment when we turn the wrong way. And then, it reminds us. It reminds us with a sound of tearing steel. It reminds us with a list to starboard. It reminds us with a girl flying through the night, landing where she shouldn't be, a living question mark in a world that thought it had all the answers. The story of the Andrea Doria is not just about a ship that sank. It is about the illusion of control. And that illusion is the only thing that is truly unsinkable. We often speak of survivors as the lucky ones. We imagine that walking away from a catastrophe is a kind of victory, a winning lottery ticket drawn from a bowl of ashes. But there is a cost to survival that the cameras do not capture. The cameras capture the reunion. They capture the tears of relief on the dock. They do not capture the silence that comes afterward, when the adrenaline fades and the mind is left to reckon with the mathematics of chance. For Linda Morgan, the miracle girl, the survival was not the end of the event. It was the beginning of an identity she did not choose. The press had their narrative. They needed it. The sinking of the Andrea Doria was a blow to the modern ego. It was a terrifying reminder that our machines are fallible. To balance the scales, the public needed a fairy tale. They needed a story of divine intervention, and Linda, plucked from her bed, flown through the air, and deposited safely on the very instrument of destruction, was the perfect vessel for that hope. Her face was everywhere. Life magazine, the front page of the New York Times. She was the girl who refused to die. The reporters didn't ask her about the sound of the steel screaming. They didn't ask her about the sister who didn't fly, the sister who was crushed in the bed next to her. They asked her how it felt to be a miracle. How does a 14-year-old answer that? How do you accept the applause of the world when your heart is hollowed out by grief? You don't. You freeze. You smile because adults tell you to smile. You pose because the flashbulbs demand it. But inside you build a wall. Linda retreated. She understood, perhaps earlier than most, that the miracle girl was not her. It was a character created by a frightened public to make themselves feel better about booking passage on the next ocean liner. The real Linda Morgan was just a girl who had lost her sister and her sense of safety in a single violent heartbeat. While Linda tried to disappear into the anonymity of adolescence, the maritime world tried to ensure that such a night would never happen again. The inquiry into the collision was quiet, technical, and devastating. It revealed that the crash wasn't an act of God. It wasn't the fog. It was the Andrea Doria phenomenon. This is the name experts gave to a new kind of disaster, the radar-assisted collision. Before radar, captains in fog stopped or slowed to a crawl. They were terrified of what they couldn't see, but with radar, they felt invincible. They drove fast, blindfolded, trusting the green light to guide them. The Andrea Doria and the Stockholm didn't collide despite the radar. They collided because of it. The technology that was supposed to prevent the accident had actually enabled it. It gave the men on the bridge the confidence to make mistakes at full speed. The laws changed. The rules of the road were rewritten. It became mandatory for ships to talk to each other, to confirm their intentions, to not just rely on a silent glowing dot. The world learned. The systems were patched. The software of maritime law was updated. But progress is cold comfort to the dead. And out in the Atlantic, 250 feet down, the Andrea Doria began her second life. A shipwreck is not a static object. It is a process. When the Doria hit the bottom, she landed on her starboard side. She was intact, a perfect sleeping city. The murals were still on the walls. The tables were still set in the dining room. The safe was still locked. But the ocean is a relentless solvent. The currents at that depth are strong. They scour the hull like sandpaper. The salt eats the rivets. The pressure squeezes the air out of the steel. The Andrea Doria became a lure. She was deep, right at the limit of what a human diver could reach on compressed air. To dive, the Doria became the ultimate badge of honor. It was the Mount Everest of scuba diving. They came in boats, anchored over the grave, and descended into the gloom. To dive the Doria is to enter a world of perpetual night. The water is cold, freezing cold. The light from the surface disappears after 100 feet. By the time you reach the wreck, you are in ink. Your flashlight cuts a narrow beam through the silt. And then she appears. A wall of steel rising out of the mud. It is a place of disorientation. Because the ship is on her side, the walls are floors, and the floors are walls. Staircases lead sideways. Doorways are holes in the ground. It is a funhouse mirror of a ship, designed to confuse the nitrogen-narcotized brain of a diver. They went for the prizes. They wanted the china. The Andrea Doria had carried thousands of pieces of custom-designed dishes, stamped with the logo of the Italian line. To bring up a plate was to prove you had been there. To bring up a bell was to be a king. But the ship fought back. The Andrea Doria is often called a man-eater. Her interior is a maze of collapsing cables, drifting fishing nets and falling debris. You can swim into a room and have the ceiling settle behind you, trapping you in the silt. 16 divers have died on the Andrea Doria since she sank. 16 men who went looking for history and found only the end of their air supply. They are there now, part of the manifest eternal passengers on a voyage that ended decades ago. The wreck is deteriorating. The superstructure has collapsed. The elegance is gone, replaced by a rust-caked skeleton. The grande dame of the sea is now a scrap heap. But she still holds her power. She draws people in with the promise of touching the past, of seeing the place where the miracle happened. But for the woman who lived the miracle, the wreck was not a trophy. It was a scar. Linda Morgan grew up. She became a woman of substance. She married. She moved to Texas. She built a life far away from the ocean, far away from the damp, grey fog of Nantucket. She worked. She raised a family. She was active in her community. She was normal, and in her normality, she performed her greatest act of defiance against the tragedy. She refused to be defined by it. She rarely spoke of the Andrea Doria. When the anniversary came around every July, and the phone would ring with reporters looking for a quote, looking for the miracle girl to reminisce about the night of terror, she would decline. She understood something that the public did not. A miracle is not a renewable resource. You cannot mine it for content forever. But the shadow was there. How could it not be? Survivor's guilt is a quiet, corrosive acid. Why me? Why did the steel break this way and not that way? Why did the bed lift me up while it crushed my sister? There is no answer. Physics does not have a conscience. Geometry does not care about love. Linda carried the memory of Joan. She carried the memory of the stepfather who searched the listing decks for her. She lived with the knowledge that her life was purchased with the currency of incredible, improbable chance. And as she grew older, the world around her began to resemble the Andrea Doria more and more. Not in the ships. Ships became safer, boring, boxy things. But in the systems we built. We live in an age of miracles now. We carry the sum of human knowledge in our pockets. We have cars that drive themselves. We have algorithms that predict our desires. We have built a civilization on the same promise that the Italian line sold in 1956. The promise that technology has conquered chaos. We look at our screens, our GPS, our weather apps, and we feel safe. We feel that the fog cannot touch us. We believe that if we just follow the green line, if we just trust the blip, we will arrive safely. But the lesson of the Andrea Doria, the lesson that Linda Morgan's life embodies, is that the screen is not the world. The map is not the territory. When we hand over our judgment to the machine, when we let the radar make the decision, we are stepping onto the bridge of the Andrea Doria. We are assuming that the system sees everything. We are assuming that the other ship knows what it is doing. But the system is only as good as the assumption it is built on. And the other ship is just people. Flawed, tired, hopeful people, peering into the dark, hoping they are right. The Andrea Doria sits in the dark, slowly dissolving into the atomic memory of the ocean. In 50 years she will be gone. The steel will have oxidized into the water. The china will be buried under feet of mud. The name on the hull will be erased. But the story remains. It remains because it is not really a story about a ship. It is a story about the gap between what we build and what we can control, the gap between the unsinkable and the iceberg, the gap between the radar blip and the steel bow. And in that gap, there is a girl. She is flying through the night, suspended over the black water, caught between two massive forces of history. She is the fragile human heart of the machine age. Linda Morgan passed away years ago, finally at rest, finally reunited with the silence. But if you listen closely to the story, you can still hear her. You can hear the sound of the foghorn bellowing every 100 seconds. You can hear the hum of the turbines. You can hear the clink of crystal in the dining room. And then you hear the silence of the fog, the silence of the radar room, the silence of the moment before impact. It is a warning. It whispers to us from the bottom of the sea. It says, respect the dark. It says, doubt the machine. It says, watch the horizon, not the screen, because the ocean is always waiting, and the miracle does not always happen twice. The blip fades, the screen goes black, but the water is forever.